Welcome everybody to the opening talk in our spring series of Books and Coffee. This is the 28th year of this program, which I think is quite a record. I'm Emma Oxford, Director of Community Relations, and this is my very first Books and Coffee, so I'm really looking forward to today's talk. I just joined Concordia a couple of months ago. In a moment, I'll invite Carlo Vittorini to introduce today's speaker, Kenneth Roman. But first, I'd just like to thank the Community Fund of Bronxville, Eastchester and Tuckahoe for their continuing support of this series, which is also helped by the Friends of Concordia. Then, just a couple of more points. Most of you know that we hold a raffle drawing at the end of the talk, and I think many of you have filled out the yellow cards that were at the door to enter your names in the raffle. If you haven't done so, I have a few extra and I can pass them around during the talk. You'll all have the opportunity to meet our speaker afterwards when he will be available in the lobby to sign copies of his books. These are for sale in the lobby, and I would encourage you all to buy one because it is a great read. Carlo Vittorini is really one of the greatest friends and supporters of Concordia College. He and his wife Nancy, who is also with us today, are well known to many of you. They've served the Bronxville community in countless ways since they moved up here from the city in 1993. In fact, last year, President V.G. George honored them with the President's Award for Excellence in Community Service. Carlo had a long and very distinguished career in publishing, and I believe that is how he got to know today's speaker and his good friend. So I would like to thank Carlo very much for persuading Kenneth Roman to visit us at Concordia and to get him to talk about his gripping book, The King of Madison Avenue. Thank you, Carlo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma. I have indeed known Ken a long time. That's one of the virtues of being retired. You can look back and remember when you first met people and how much you've enjoyed the relationship. Ken was had been in 2 or 3 jobs before he joined Ogilvy. He was in his 30s. And he wanted to do it so much he accepted about the lowest position you can get in account work, which is an assistant account executive. But he managed to be assigned to the general foods account, and it was a perfect blend. He rose quickly. He became involved in other accounts. He became one of senior management, and before his 20 or 30 year anyway, active relationship with the agency was over, he was chairman worldwide of Ogilvy. And in that position, he got to know and appreciate David Ogilvy on a very close relationship. And he had written several other books. He keeps busy. He wrote several books, very successful. One of them is in its 3rd or 4th printing on advertising, and he decided he could do that with Mr. Ogilvy, and so he did. His publishers were elated with the effort, quite a substantial print order, and he has been besieged by requests to speak all over the country, and I'm privileged, and I'm sure you feel the same way, to have him here with us today. Ken Roman.
Hey, can you hear me all right? I promised I'd run a sound check. Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Emma. Carlo is what we call a long-tenured friend. We don't say an old friend anymore. Actually, Emma, I'm very pleased to be here at Concordia. The college has a long, distinguished heritage. I mean, I was just knocked out with 125 years. It's just amazing. But I really liked on the website, it says profiles and excellence. Now, I've got to tell you that not every college website has something like that, but profiles and excellence is exactly what David Ogilvy was about. He would very much appreciate that here, so I really am thrilled to be here. Carlo and I met actually on a tennis court at a convention of the American Association of Advertising Agencies, I think at the Greenbrier. Remember when business conventions were considered a good idea? Well, the good old days. And over the years, we played tennis together. We also worked together because a lot of my clients were in the food business, and they were in all of his magazines. So we had a very good relationship. We competed there for years, and now he's moved to a higher level of competition. He is now playing bridge with my wife, Ellen, who's here. And let me tell you, that's really much more difficult. The first thing I want to tell you is that this is a book by an advertising man, about an advertising man, but I want to relax you. It is not an advertising book. David Ogilvy was the most famous advertising man in the world, by far, and still is, to a large extent still is. He was the most important advertising man, and I'm going to make that case, and he was far and away the most interesting man in the business. Nobody challenges that. Carlos said I met David in 1963 when I joined this medium-sized agency called Ogilvy Benson & Mather. It was the only one in New York that would give me a job. And he was 52 and he was famous already. And you wouldn't expect this junior would meet this world-famous guy, except that he really was interested in the General Foods account, and he also had another client he was interested in that I was working on. And he wrote a letter to one of my clients. Actually, it was the Gillette company. And the Gillette design department had come up with an advertising campaign that they wanted us to consider to run for their business, one of their brands. And David hated that campaign, just hated it. So he writes a 2-page letter to my client with a copy to me, 8 reasons why it's a bad idea. And the 8th reason, I'll never forget, it said, the only thing that can be said in favor of the layouts is that they're different. Well, you can make a cow look different by removing the udder, but that cow would not produce results. Well, I had never seen a letter like that. I mean, I just didn't know what to do with it. You just don't throw it away, you don't file it. So I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and by the time I left there 26 years later, I had a lot of memos and a lot of speeches and a lot of memorable things like that. Almost everybody in the agency at that stage had one of those David files. So when I left, I kept on looking at all these files. By that time, I really had a substantial number, and I said, what am I going to do with these things? And I said, I wonder if there's a biography there. No biography had been written. He had written 3 books. He told his story all the time, in interviews, in articles, in his books, in his autobiography. Now, his autobiography, the title was Blood, Brains, and Beer. And it came, he said, from his Scottish father, who commanded his son every day to drink a glass, now you got to get ready for this, a glass of raw blood, brain for intelligence, brains several times a week, 3 times a week, blood for strength, brains for intelligence, all washed down by a glass of beer. and the book was a bust, as you can imagine. He said the title was repulsive, and so was my ego. But I said, I still looked at it, I said, there is no biography, and is there anything more to be told? I said, well, maybe there are three things I thought I could do when I went to start out to say if I could do something with it. The first one is to bring alive his idiosyncratic personality, and I'll give you a little sense of that today, to give a sense of just his relevance and his legacy. Because he was famous, that doesn't, what kind of a legacy was there? And thirdly, what kind of lessons could we learn? What still makes sense today? And give you a sense of his leadership. He was an instinctive leader. I did, 120 personal interviews. I visited his homes in England, in France. I'll tell you about that in a minute. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the Amish country, where he had a farm. And in Paris, I went through his papers. I got papers from 3 or 4 other libraries, and then went through when he went to France, he left his papers to the Library of Congress. His brother-in-law, Rosser Reeves, very famous advertising man, ran Ted Bates and Company, told him one day, he said, David, I've given they had a funny relationship, David and Rosser. He said, I've given my papers to the Wisconsin Historical Society. And David said, oh, that's marvelous, Rosser, what an honor. I wish I could do that. And he said, but I can't. And Rosser said, why not? He said, well, I've given my papers to the Library of Congress. And they are there, 30,000. And I went through them. It took me 4 trips down to Washington, 2 days at a time is about all you can take. And I found a lot of great things there, some great stories and funny stories. And Ellen, my wife, was with me during this, did a lot of the research with me. She listened to me try out some of these stories. She edited every page, and I give her full credit in the book and the acknowledgments, and I also dedicated the book to her. I said to Ellen, who married the agency as well as the author, and her comment was, it was frequently easier being married to the agency. Now, I don't have a slide presentation, but I just have a couple of slides I want to show you to give a sense of what he looked like. This is the cover of the book, and now his first ad that he ever wrote, when he started his agency, he was not the creative director. He was the research director, and I will explain that in a minute. And he was on the train to Greenwich, Connecticut, and he was looking for a campaign for Guinness, his client, and he came up with this idea of showing Guinness with the foods that go well with Guinness. And here was the first one. It's the Guinness Guide to Oysters. The copy is magnificently written. And then it was the Guinness Guide to Game Birds, Guinness Guide to Cheeses, and that was a big success. But the ad that really made him famous, put him on the map, was the man in the Hathaway shirt with his eye patch. The story that's been told is that he was on, that's Baron Wrangel. There was nothing wrong with his eye. Ogilvy was on the way to the photo shoot, and he stopped off at the drugstore, and he bought an eye patch, black eye patch for $1.50, and he gave it to the photographer, and he said, try a few of these, and then just to humor me, and then we'll get back to the real thing. He said, but he realized when he saw the photos, we had something. He had more than something. That ad ran that first ad, one insertion in one magazine, the New Yorker, sold out every Hathaway shirt in New York. More than that, it started to appear in other ads. Other advertisers started putting eye patches on their models. Even dogs. I'm not making... there were people showed up at big fancy dress balls wearing eye patches. There were cartoons in the New Yorker, the magazine that was running the ad campaign, and they had one panel. There were 3 guys are standing in front of a haberdashery and looking at a window with the that ad and a bunch of shirts, and they walk into the store, and then when they walk out again, they're all wearing eye patches. The next ad, the next campaign that really made him even more famous was Commander Whitehead for Schweppes, introducing Schweppes tonic in the U.S., and popularizing gin and tonic, which was not a big drink in this country. It is in Emma's country, but not in ours. And Commander Whitehead, it doesn't show well in this ad, was a big guy, a physical fitness buff, and he had this great red, bushy beard. He was a quintessentially perfect model, and he was the president of Schweppes USA. And he's supposedly bringing the secret of Schweppes elixir to the U.S. And he said, you know what was in that briefcase? Here he is looking like a diplomat. What was in that briefcase, he said, that was my bathing suit in there. But he became so famous, you could only get Schweppes in many bars in New York. Gin and tonic became a very popular drink. He went to Hollywood, he went to Hollywood and Gary Cooper asked for his autograph. Cab drivers would turn around and say, "Are you Mr. Schweppes?" It was a phenomenon. It was more than a successful campaign, it was a phenomenon. Then he wrote what is, most people agree, is the most famous headline in the car business. At 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Rolls-Royce is the sound of the electric clock. That ad ran in 2 newspapers, 2 magazines. It sold so many Rolls-Royce cars that Rolls couldn't run it again. They didn't have enough production. So Ogilvy, in typical form, said to one of his colleagues, he said, imagine if General Motors or Ford hired Ogilvy Benson and Mather. What kind of they would get. So those were all famous, and they made him famous very quickly. His biggest sales success, however, is none of those. It's one that is least associated with him, but it is Dove. The client Lever Brothers came to us and they said, we have created the first pH neutral soap, not acid, not alkaline. We want you to present it that way. And Ogilvy said, I don't think anybody's interested in that. So he said, he went to see the chemist, what's in the product, and he discovered one of the ingredients was stearic acid, which was the same as a lot of the deep cleansers that were being sold at the time. It was about 1/4 of the ingredients, so he positioned Dove as 1/4 cleansing cream, won't dry your skin the way soap can. And Dove is now, how many years later? That was 1955, so more than 50 years later. Dove is now the largest selling cleansing brand in the world, bigger than anything from Procter & Gamble, the great soap company. It's a great and enduring success story. So here he is in the 1950s. He was in his early 40s at that time, with some of the ads behind him, characteristically with a pipe. He was almost always had a pipe in his mouth. His ads behind him there, dressed in a tweed suit, playing one of his many roles. He was movie star handsome, and the women thought he was just terrific. And he really was handsome in his own right. When he started, he had flaming red hair, but he also was an actor. And the important thing in understanding him is an instinctive actor. He had a sense of exits and entrances. He dressed for his parts. When he first came to New York, he sometimes wore a long black cape with a scarlet lining. People thought he looked like Heathcliff coming off the moors. Sometimes he would go to a big black tie event in a kilt when nobody had really seen kilts very much. Here he's playing the English schoolmaster, you see, and he frequently wore the tweed suit and some thick shoes. And he also was a charismatic speaker, and he would, just on the basis of his speech, get terrific applause, but if he didn't think it was quite enough, when people were applauding, he'd go, and the next day, the papers would report a standing ovation. He just had a sense, he was an actor. Then, as the business changed and a lot of other things happened, I'll explain, he retired to a chateau in France, a little 30-room chateau, about a couple of hours southwest of Paris. It has a dry moat around it where they used to keep wild boar. And it was a new stage for him. It was a larger stage. And we had board meetings there and creative meetings and international meetings, and clients quite liked it. And then here he is at 75 at the chateau. As you can see, a handsome guy at 75. That photograph, incidentally, was taken by the famous photographer Annie Leibovitz, who was doing an American Express campaign for us. And she went over there. We persuaded her to go over and take a picture for his 75th birthday, and he thought it was a good idea, and she agreed to do it. And they fought for 2 days. It was just terrible. She left in tears. She said, Mr. Ogilvy, how would you like to be photographed? He said, well, in a carriage with 4 horses. She said, why don't you stand over by the tool shed and put on these old clothes and leave the top button unbuttoned? He said, oh. He said, why don't you put on a kilt? He said, I'm not going to put on a kilt. It was a terrible time, but we got a great photograph. I knew when I started this I had a great subject, but I didn't really realize what a great story it would turn out to be. It's an absolutely implausible story. Implausible. He was born in 1911. His mother was Irish. He was born in England. His mother was Irish. His father was a Scot. That's all that counts, say the Scots, if your father's a Scot. He went to one of these terrible British boarding schools called St. Cyprian's, where the Brits used to send their kids away when they were 8 years old. Little boys. Well, they went off to run the empire in the army and the civil service, and these were run by a headmaster and his wife. And if the wife was a kind of a motherly type, that was good for the kids. But if she wasn't, it was really rotten. And it was the luck of the draw, and he was unlucky. He had at St. Cyprian's a mother, a house mother, if you will, who George Orwell, who went to the same school, George used as the model for Big Brother in 1984. She humiliated the kids. Now, David's father had been a stockbroker, marginally successful, and then the stock market crash came and he lost most of his money and they had to fire their servants. He was sort of upper middle class, and he had some servants. My image is always the family in Mary Poppins, that kind of a family, upper middle class, and but he had to move in with his parents, and from then on he went to school on scholarships. And he went to St. Cyprian's, and she said, this wife of the headmistress said, you can't order that. How can you order that? You're here on a scholarship. She said that in front of everybody. He's an 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid. But he survived, and he went to a school in Edinburgh called Fettes, which is a great school. It's sort of, many people call it the Eton of Scotland. The main building is this Gothic structure that was the model for the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Witchery. Remember, J.K. Rowling lives in Edinburgh. And people in England, if you mention Fettes, they say, oh, Tony Blair's school. Well, Tony Blair's school taught these kids to speak well and write well. It was a discipline, an incredible discipline, and he sort of made it through there. And he got into Oxford, again on a scholarship. He went to Christ Church College, which was the most aristocratic, And that was all downhill from there. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He changed his major studies from classicals, modern studies, to medicine. He was going to be a surgeon like his grandfather. Back again, he had health problems. He had mastoids in the days before sulfur drugs. It was just awful. And he just wasn't a student like a lot of very talented, successful people. He wasn't meant for academia. So, and he was perpetually late for class. So he would come into a room like this, one of these great lecture halls, and the professor's up in front, and he'd come in late, and the professor would stop to draw attention to him, and Ogilvy would turn around and look and say to the professor, "If you insult me like that again, I shall not return to this class." Well, he wasn't long for Oxford, and he left there. What did he do? I told you it was an implausible story. He goes to Paris and he becomes a sous chef in the greatest kitchen of Paris at the Hotel Majestic, and I checked the Michelin ratings in that year, and it had more Michelin stars. And it was run by this imperious head chef, Monsieur Pitard. And you have to get the picture. They're all these sous chefs in their white uniforms and their toques, and this wall is lined with hot ovens, and they went from early in the morning till late at night, and by 10 in the morning, everybody was drenched with sweat. And what did he do? David Ogilvy didn't learn from academia, but he learned from his life experiences. From Monsieur Pitard, he learned, first of all, leadership. How do you manage a brigade of hot-tempered Burgundy cooks? Well, he learned he watched how Pitard did that. He also learned perfection. Pitard came over to him one day and said, David, what is not perfect is bad. And he learned, perfection, high standards. Well, he wasn't going to be a chef all of his life, so what was the next unlikely step he took? He started selling, Aga cookers. In England and France and continent, it's the Rolls-Royce of cooking stoves, most expensive stove, and many people think the best. He sold them door to door to Scottish housewives at the depths of the Depression, and he became their best salesman. Because he charmed people. He was a great salesman. He learned to be a great salesman. And he was so good that the company asked him to write a sales manual for the other salesmen. Fortune magazine wrote that it was probably the best sales manual that's ever been written. Now let me just give you a little taste of it. The whole manual is like this. Remember, it's a sales manual. There's one section called Economy. Stress the fact that no cook can make her aga burn more fuel than 4 pounds a year. However stupid, extravagant, or careless she may be, or however much she may cook, if more fuel is being consumed, it's being stolen, and the police should be called in immediately. Well, he wasn't going to be a stove salesman all of his life, so he takes the manual, he sends it to his elder brother Francis, who was the big influence in his life, and was running a top agency in London at that time, and he got a job as a trainee in the offices of Mather and Crowther. By the way, that's where people say in Ogilvy and Mather, who's Mather? Well, it came from Mather and Crowther, this British agency of the middle 1800s. And he spends a short time there, and he talks the agency into sending him to the U.S. to study U.S. advertising techniques. I didn't really show you that. I'm going to go back to that picture. I'm sorry. I'm going to find that if I can. I guess I can't. I should have left that alone, right? Well, right up there in the top, the second one, that's on the, I didn't really give you that pic. That's him coming to the U.S. In his, I don't know why I skipped over that, in 1938, when he was 27 years old, to study U.S. advertising techniques, and he came back, less than a year later to tell the agency all the things they were doing wrong. And then but he wasn't going to stay here. He wanted to come to the U.S. All of his life he wanted to go to the U.S. He said, I read Huckleberry Finn over and over. I wanted to float on a raft down the Mississippi. He read everything he could about the U.S., but he was always wanting to come to the U.S. So he came back from his U.S. studies, told the agency what he had learned, then went back to the U.S., and he got a job with George Gallup, doing public opinion polling doing public opinion polling in the movie business in California, working for the big Hollywood studios, telling them which stars were going to be successful or not. He called them box office poison. He ruined many stars' careers, they said. Which movies were going to be successful or not. And he pioneered a lot of movie research. And what he learned from that experience, of course, was he became a researcher. He learned market research, and that was another defining experience. We're now into the years just before World War II, and Britain is in the war. They're being bombed, and we were helping the Brits undercover, and there was an organization set up called British Security Coordination, and it was run by a man named Sir William Stevenson. If you ever heard of a book called A Man Called Intrepid, he was intrepid. He founded British Security Coordination, which helped set up our OS, Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. They showed us how to create an intelligence organization. And so he did really commercial espionage for British Security Coordination. But he went to Camp X up in Canada, where he was taught the techniques of how do you follow somebody and how do you disarm people. And he said he learned how to stop an attack from a police dog, a German Shepherd. He said you take the paws and you rip the dog's chest apart. Well, anybody who knew Ogilvy just laughed at that because he was a physical coward. People at the height of the age said I could win an argument by walking into his office and taking 2 menacing steps toward him. I could just win the argument. So the idea that he was going to rip a police dog's paws apart was just bizarre, but he became close to Stevenson and very much admired him. Then after the war was over, he became second secretary of the British Embassy in Washington, and then he decided he was offered a chance to stay there permanently, but he decided not to. And then, not knowing what to do, like a lot of people after World War II, what did he do in his next unlikely step? He became a farmer in the Amish country of Pennsylvania. He loved the Amish, and they loved him. These plain, simple people, not using any machinery, no cars, and this flamboyant guy, it was a love affair, and it remained so the whole of his life. So he bought a farm there, and he tried to farm tobacco, and he wasn't any good at that. But every night, he would go and study in his room. He got the Lancaster Library to send him ads from around the world and books, and he studied. And at the age of 38, never really having worked in advertising, he opens an advertising agency on Madison Avenue to compete with the big established agencies of the day. And within 10 to 12 years, he is the most talked about person on Madison Avenue with the campaigns I just showed you. And not too long after that, he's famous around the world. Those campaigns that I mentioned, Hathaway, Schweppes, Rolls, he also did Puerto Rico. He put Pablo Casals walking on the beach in Puerto Rico. He says the most important thing he ever did was to change the image of this squalid island. He brought factories to Puerto Rico. He told the governor, he said, listen, if you just keep building factories, this place is going to become like Detroit. He said, why don't you do an arts festival as they did in Edinburgh, my native country. It wasn't his native country at all. But he said Rudolph Bing started one. So they started the Pablo Casals Arts Festival. And we put Pablo Casals in the ads. He did advertising for Britain, the British Travel Authority. Come to Britain campaign brought millions and millions of visitors to England. And then he did Dove. During that 10 or 12 year period, that's when he created most of his great campaigns. He said they were what is called his big ideas. And the way he put it, he said, unless your campaign is based on a big idea, it will pass like a ship in the night. And they were big ideas, and they lasted. They lasted for 20, 30, 40 years. But then he said, then I was an extinct volcano. He said it all went out. And he did something else. He moved on to building the agency that he had started, which by that time was called Ogilvy Benson. It became Ogilvy and Mather from Ogilvy Benson and Mather. And he charmed his clients, and he was brilliant at new business. But he was just terrific with clients. He saw Helena Rubinstein. Madame Rubinstein was then in her 80s, getting out of a car in front of a puddle, and he runs across the street, takes off his coat, his jacket, and puts it in the gutter for her to walk on. He would do that kind of thing all the time. But what he really did, he set down principles for building the agency. Many people think the best advertisement he ever wrote was not any of the ones I showed you. It was an ad called How to Run an Advertising Agency. It ran one time in the Wall Street Journal. We were getting reprints for that 10 years later, but they're principles that apply to any business, particularly any service business. He was while he was known today as a creative genius, he really was an instinctive leader, and the thing that he was very proud about was building that agency. But the way he did it was not the way corporate America does it, with mission, vision, values, and all the things that people say, oh, we should do that, but you really wonder does it have any real effect. He did it like himself in a dramatic way. So the directors would show up at a board meeting, and they'd find these Russian dolls, the nesting dolls, one inside another, and inside each director, inside the smallest one, he had put a piece of paper, and it said, if we hire people who are smaller than we are, we'll become a company of dwarfs. If we hire people who are bigger than we are, we'll become a company of giants. Hire people who are better than you and pay them more if necessary. That's how we'll build a great agency. Now, if he had written a memo that said we should hire better people, nobody would disagree with that, but they'd forget it in 3 minutes. Nobody forgot the Russian dolls. Are we hiring big people? He would say, go into your office and work. Stop sitting around just doing nothing. And he said, here's one you'll never forget. Search your parks in all your cities. You won't find statues of any committees. You can use that one, right? But he also built a corporate culture, which was based on people. And that's the central thing about that agency. If you ever meet anybody who worked at that place, at any time, they will all tell you the same thing, an incredible feeling for people. And I'm going to take just a minute. I want to read you a statement about corporate culture, which shows you his statement about it. He said, our system of management is singularly democratic. We don't like hierarchical bureaucracy or rigid pecking orders. We abhor ruthlessness. We like people with gentle manners. Our New York office goes so far as to give an award for what they call professionalism combined with civility. We like people who are honest in argument, honest with clients, honest with suppliers, honest with the company. We admire people who work hard. Objectivity and thoroughness are admired. Superficiality is not admired. We despise and detest office politicians, toadies, bullies, and pompous asses. The way up the ladder is open to anybody. We are free from prejudice of any kind, religious prejudice, racial prejudice, or sexual prejudice. We detest nepotism. He wrote the memos. No spouses, no nepots. You couldn't have anybody who was related to you in any way. We detest any form of favoritism. In promoting people to top jobs, we are as influenced as much by that character as by anything else. Well, how can you not admire a company like that? You say, well, did he do it? Let me tell you, he did. Now, he himself was kind of a snob in his own personal relationship. The agency was absolutely without politics because he refused to hire people, as I say, who were related to each other or in any. We wouldn't hire a client. Not only wouldn't we hire a relative of a client, if we were pursuing a client, we wouldn't hire their kids if they were a target because we didn't want to have somebody in that position. It was really quite an experience. And so he built a heck of an agency, and it grew. And then, as I say, it was an unlikely story, but he was very good at telling his story. But as I did this research, I found something else. I found out that it was almost true. It was true, but he sort of had an ability to embellish a little bit. He said, for example, at Oxford, he said, I failed every exam. I was sent down. I was tossed out. It was the worst mistake of my life. Well, I went through the archives at Oxford. There's no evidence he failed any exams. And there's no evidence he was tossed out. What happened is this kid is not sure what he wants to do. He has health problems, and he just didn't like going to school. But what he really did is he dropped out, but that isn't a very good line. If you're an actor, you want a good line. He said, instead of saying I dropped out, he said, I was thrown out. It was the worst experience. When he started his agency, he said, I had made a list of the 5 clients I wanted most. Well, I went through these papers at the Library of Congress, and I found a list. The only list I found had 19 clients on it. It didn't have the clients he listed, which were General Foods and Lever Brothers and Shell and Bristol Myers. It had a couple of them, but not all of them. And the number 1 on the list was not any of those big clients. It was the Cunard lines, which was hardly a big one. But like an actor, he wanted to give himself better lines. And I just found that over and over again. Now, if all he did was to be a really, really colorful character and write a half a dozen or so great ads, you don't write a book about that guy, because there are a lot of people in the business who are very talented, who are very interesting, who have a portfolio of good ads. I think that he was far more than a guy who wrote some ads. He changed the business. He made it more professional. He made it more professional, first in the sense that he brought consumer research into the business to help develop ads based upon objective judgment. That came from his Gallup experience. And some evidence how the research community views that is they now give an award every year called the David Ogilvy ARF, Advertising Research Foundation Award. The David Ogilvy ARF Award is the top research award. He picked up on direct mail when it was a tiny, tiny part of the business. We started a direct mail department. He just adored direct mail because the experience of being a stove salesman, aga kuka salesman, turned him into a salesman. That was the defining experience for him. And he really felt that direct mail, it was accountable, you could measure the results, and as he said, we sell or else. And some evidence how the direct mail, now the direct marketing community, thinks of him as he's the only general advertising man in the direct marketing Hall of Fame. And I really can make the case that direct marketing is the spiritual parent of the internet. It's measurable, it's accountable, it sells. You either do it or you don't. It either works or it doesn't work. In 1955, he wrote a speech that said, "Every advertisement contributes to the personality of the brand." He took the concept of brand out of an academic paper and put it on the map, and became known as the apostle of brand image. Now, we're all surrounded by brands. I mean, brands are everywhere, not just in marketing. There was a story in the paper the other day. We've all read about all the financial problems, but at AIG, with all the other problems that AIG is having, the headline in the New York Times was, "At AIG, the brand is tarnished." The brand is tarnished. And their ability to launch new products, attract people, and do things has been compromised by their problems. He became the model. He brought civilized good taste into the business, and he was a consumerist. The way he said it, though, was unlike the consumerist today, which is so sober and serious. He said, "The consumer is not a moron, she's your wife. Don't insult her intelligence, don't lie to her. You wouldn't lie to your wife, don't lie to mine." So he became known. He campaigned against billboards. He said, "Who's in favor of billboards? They just spoil the landscape." Then in 1963, he wrote a book called Confessions of an Advertising Man, and that really elevated him to another level. It became famous around the world, sold well over 1 million copies. We really can't count anymore. It's the only book on advertising most people outside the business have ever read. And he gave a lot of quotable speeches and interviews. And in 1982, a French magazine wrote a piece called on the 15 people who had contributed most to the Industrial Revolution. You see, we've moved beyond advertising to something broader. Number 1 was John Maynard Keynes. Number 2 is Louis Pasteur, Karl Marx. And in 7th place, David Ogilvy, the Pope of modern advertising. And so he takes that article and he sends it to the fellow directors with a note saying, "Will the College of Cardinals please come to attention?" He was married 3 times, the first one to Melinda Street from one of the first families of Virginia. They had 1 son, whose name was David Fairfield Ogilvy. In Greenwich, Connecticut, David Ogilvy, that is David Ogilvy, or David Ogilvy and Associates, who sells most of the high-end homes. He's a lovely guy. He's really famous in Greenwich. And when his father would come visit him in Greenwich and go to the local hardware store and take out his American Express card, the merchant would say, "David Ogilvy, are you the David Ogilvy, the famous real estate man?" He and his wife went to a house party one weekend, and he came home with another man's wife. So that marriage wasn't going to make it long term. So after 18 years, they divorced, and he married Ann Cabot of Boston. He was always proud of saying he married a Cabot of Boston. Well, yes and no. He married Ann Flint, who married Tommy Cabot. So a little bit of stretching, embellishing again. And he promised her he was going to travel around the world, and they were going to see everything. And in fact, he took home 2 briefcases home every night, and he worked. He worked harder than anybody in the entire agency. He took 2 briefcases at home every night, and on weekends he played no sports. He didn't play golf or tennis. That was time for more work. Vacations. He wrote Confessions of an Advertising Man on a vacation. So that marriage didn't last forever. And then the agency kind of had grown by this time, had grown internationally. First of all, he hated to travel. He hated to fly. He was terrified of flying. He took trains everywhere. To go to our Houston office, he would go to Chicago and then down to Houston. It took 2 days. To go to the coast, that he would take the trains all over, from the top of India to the bottom of India, through these terrible stations. So he couldn't cover an international company without flying, which he did only reluctantly. Also, he knew the business was changing, and he was a print guy. All those ads I showed you were magazine ads or newspaper ads. He really didn't understand television. So he handed the agency off to his associate Jacques Elliott, and he retired to that chateau in France. And what did he do there? He worked harder. Now he isn't running the agency. He just wrote more memos and letters. He wrote so much the local postmaster got a raise because the volume had increased. He wrote all the time, and he got all these international awards for lifetime achievement. And then when he's in, I've got to stop for a minute. I'm making him seem like too much of a paragon. He had some eccentricities that you just wouldn't believe. They're hard to credit. The worst was food. He would go to a restaurant, and the maitre d' would list the specialties of the house that day, and he'd say, after going through the whole list, he'd say, "I want grape nuts." Or he'd go to another restaurant, hear the same litany, and he said, "I want a plate of ketchup," as his entire dinner. I could have written a whole chapter or more just on these stories. If I did it, you would have said, "This guy is, I don't believe it," but he would do it. He could be childishly and intentionally rude in a restaurant, we assume, to get attention, but that was one of those eccentricities. Oh, that's David, what do you say? So his, sorry, this keeps falling down on me. His third wife, when he moved to the chateau, Herta Lands, who lived in she lived nearby. She was of Mexican, of German, English descent. She was the only one who could figure him out. She knew she just didn't take any of this nonsense. She would go to the restaurant in advance and order his meal so it would be on the table when he got there. She just knew how to handle him, and she's still living in the chateau now, and she's a wonderful lady. Everybody liked all of his wives and all of his girlfriends. As a matter of fact, he always was a gardener. This story is not in the book. My wife wouldn't let me put it in there, but I can tell it to you now. He really knew gardening, knew the Latin names. He's going through Savile, I don't know how many of you are gardeners, but he's going through Savile Gardens in London, which is a lovely garden in Windsor Great Park. And they came upon a plant, and he said to one of the people he was with, he said, "You know what that plant is? That's called Fremontodendron californicum. It is named for Fremont, the governor of California. I slept with his daughter." The last great campaign of his life, however, was the one that came out of his days as a salesman. He really thought that advertising was taking a bad turn. And to some extent it has. He felt it was because the awards competition, the advertising business is one of these businesses that gives awards to itself. Based creative directors and art directors giving awards to each other. And so what's rewarded frequently is outstanding production techniques or humor because of the nature of the business. Now, the client's sales may be going to hell, but there's a new television, you're all going to ask me about Mad Men, but the television show, but there's another show called Trust Me on advertising, which takes place in an advertising agency. And in the first scene, the creative director, the head of the agency, walks into the creative team's office and says, "Now listen, you guys, if we don't win more awards, you're fired." There's nothing about if you don't save this client, build the client's business, do something for the client. Well, Ogilvy hated that. So he campaigned, he said, there's a disease called entertainment that's infecting our business. And he retreated really to the direct marketing business, which he thought still had some sense left. And he really made that his last great campaign. Now he's living in this glorious chateau, writing memos, getting awards for lifetime achievement. People are visiting him. He's being honored everywhere. And in the middle of all of that, the agency is hit by a hostile takeover by a British holding company called WPP. And he always regretted taking the agency public. He used to write me these memos saying, exculpate my sin. The worst mistake I ever made was going public. Can't we go private? I'd say, well, I'd like to. I didn't take it public, David. But no, we can't. It's just too expensive. So eventually this WPP put too much money on the table. And he campaigned against this. I mean, he gave interviews. He said, the fellow who runs WPP is a quite short man. He said, this odious little shit buys his clients. I won mine. He doesn't care anything about advertising. All he cares about is money. Well, of course, the press picked that up about this odious little jerk. And David said, no, that isn't what I said. But there was too much money on the table. And surprisingly, and he offered, this fellow Martin Sorrell offered David the non-executive chairmanship of WPP, which to our surprise and horror, he accepted. And he was a fish out of water. It was a financial job. He didn't know it. He did it for a few years. It was an embarrassment, but he did it. And it was a very sad, it was a poignant ending there. And he died in 1999 at the age of 88. And I spoke to somebody who was at Oxford with him, a lady in New York, Margot Wilkie, wonderful lady. I said, Margot, can I come talk to you about David? She said, oh, I'd love to. I've known all of his wives, all of his girlfriends. He has done rather well for an immigrant, don't you think? Thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer your questions.